On a mild September afternoon, the village of St. Mary Mead had decided, in its own modest way, to be exotic. Or so Mrs. Dolly Bantry declared, fanning herself as she surveyed the vicarage lawn with satisfaction. Colored lanterns were strung from the apple trees. Someone had scattered sand about the base of a painted cardboard sphinx, and a somewhat tottering backdrop of pyramids leaned against the wall of the church hall. A large hand-lettered notice announced, "A.N. Evening on the Nile. Slides, refreshments, and first-hand experiences. Speaker Mr. Lionel Hart of Egyptian Irrigation Service." "It's practically heathen," Dolly confided to Miss Marple, lowering herself into a garden chair. "Missionary bazaar or not, I shouldn't be at all surprised if we were all struck by lightning." Miss Jane Marple, who sat knitting a white baby's jacket with her usual air of vague benignity, made a small, non-committal murmur. Her mild blue eyes appeared to rest only on her needles, yet they took note of the little groupings and glances that played across the vicarage lawn with far more interest than the painted pyramids. There was Mrs. Lionel Hart, for instance. She was pretty in a pale, unsuitable way, wearing a frock that a girl 10 years younger might have chosen. She laughed rather too loudly at something said by Major Henley, whose bald head shone under a paper lantern. Her husband, by contrast, stood somewhat apart, a dark, self-contained man with the careful politeness of one more used to being obeyed than liked. His recent return from Egypt, after years of doing something mysterious with sluices and natives, as Dolly put it, was still a subject for village interest. Miss Marple's eye moved on. Near the lemonade table, Colonel Melrose of the county police conversed with Dr. Haydock, both men exuding an air of being there, under protest. Young Molly Pierce, the vicar's nervous parlour-maid, hovered with a tray of seed cake, her gaze stealing again and again towards Mrs. Hart. Each time Major Henley bent his head to say something confidential, Molly's knuckles whitened on the tray. Jealousy, Miss Marple reflected, slipping her needle neatly through a loop of wool, produced much the same expression in parlour-maids and peeresses. It was, she often thought, one of the great levellers. At 4:30 the lanterns were lit against the fading light, and the little crowd was marshalled into rows of chairs, facing a sheet tacked somewhat crookedly to a frame. Mr. Clement, the vicar, bustled about, exuding anxious goodwill. His wife, a practical woman with an unshakable belief in Church of England efficiency, propelled Mr. Hart gently but firmly towards the makeshift platform. "You must tell them about everything, Mr. Hart," she urged. "The temples and the floods and all that mystery. It will help them understand the good work being done." Mr. Hart gave a slight bow and mounted the platform. The lights were lowered until the lanterns glowed like colored fruit among the branches. The projector whirred, and the first slide appeared, rather disappointingly, nothing more than a stretch of muddy riverbank under a pale sky. "This," Mr. Hart began, in a dry, measured voice, "is the Nile near Wadi Halfa. It is perhaps not what you expect." A polite ripple of amusement went round. Mrs. Hart did not join in. She was watching her husband's back, the fringe of her shawl twisting between restless fingers. From behind them came the faint clink of glass as Molly set her tray down on a table, out of sight but not out of hearing. The second slide showed a village, mud brick houses, a cluster of palms, women carrying water. Mr. Hart talked of drought and flood, of British organization and native custom. His words were correct and informative. But to Miss Marple, who continued to knit, there was a remoteness in them, as though any true feeling had been stored away in some locked compartment of his mind. It was during the fourth slide, an impressive temple fade carved with figures, that the disturbance occurred. One of the lanterns hanging from an apple bough directly above the platform began to sway. At first it was a slight, almost imperceptible movement, easily attributable to a draught. But the evening was very still. The lantern swung wider. colored light washed across the sheet in uneasy arcs, making the carved figures on the temple seem to writhe. There was a subdued murmur. Someone said, "Careful now." The vicar half rose from his chair. With a sharp, startling crack, the cord gave way. The lantern dropped straight down onto Mr. Hart's head. There was the splintering crash of glass, the reek of spilled paraffin, and then darkness as the projector snapped off. For a second there was only stunned silence. Then Molly Pierce gave a high, thin scream. By the time the lantern was seized and the lights fumbled on again, Lionel Hart lay crumpled beside the projector, his face oddly still in the sudden glare. A dark stain spread slowly across the white of the sheet. Miss Marple, who had risen more quickly than one might have expected of her age, stood quite still and watched. In her experience, accidents in English villages were very seldom accidental. For a moment, there was only a stunned silence, as though the whole garden had frozen in place. Then people began to move all at once, voices rising, chairs scraping on the lawn, the rustle of silk and linen as guests hurried toward the replica barge. "Everyone stay where you are, please," cried Colonel Bantry, his military training asserting itself. His usually genial face was now stern. No sense in trampling over everything. We must have some order. But order, Miss Marple reflected, was precisely what one could not reasonably expect from a garden party where murder had just been announced. She rose, her joints protesting only slightly, and made her way after the first rush of people. She did not push, nor exclaim, nor indulge in any of the hysterics that seemed to afflict Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell, who were both talking at once about foreigners and fate in shrill tones. Elena Whitmore had gone quite still. Her dark eyes were fixed on the cabin doorway, her face drained of color beneath its careful makeup. Only her hands betrayed her, fingers clenching and unclenching convulsively around her embroidered handbag. Dr. Marcus Finch, pale but composed, had already moved toward Mrs. Bantry. "Please, Dolly, sit down," he urged, guiding her to a nearby chair. "You must keep calm. Colonel, I should go in at once." Yes, Finch," Bantry agreed gruffly. "You and I will see what the devil's happened. No one else is to go near that cabin. Do you hear?" Miss Hartwell hung back slightly, notebook still in hand, though the pen trembled between her fingers. Her eyes were very bright. Stories, Miss Marple thought, were meat and drink to such a young woman. But even the most ambitious journalist might find actual murder rather more disturbing than the printed word. Miss Marple, by contrast, had known murder in too many quiet corners of England not to accept it as part of the world, unfortunate though that might be. She did not approach the cabin, but she did observe very carefully who did, and who did not. Elena Whitmore took one step forward, then stopped abruptly, almost as if she had walked into an invisible barrier. "Nigel," she whispered. It was not clear whether anyone heard her in the hubbub. "Mrs. Whitmore," Miss Marple said gently, coming to her side. "Perhaps it would be best to sit down for a moment. These sudden shocks are very trying on the nerves." The younger woman turned toward her, as if noticing her presence for the first time. Yes, she said faintly. "Thank you. I cannot quite. This must be some ghastly mistake." Miss Marple guided her to a seat a little removed from the general commotion, from where one had an excellent view of the barge and the milling guests. It was a place, she reflected, where a great many things could be seen without oneself being particularly noticed. From within the cabin came the murmur of men's voices, then Dr. Finch's low, decisive tone. After what seemed a very short time, he emerged, his expression grave. "I'm afraid it's true," he said loudly enough for all to hear. "Professor Whitmore is dead." A collective gasp went up. Behind Miss Marple, someone began to sob quietly. Dead? Elena half rose, clutching the arms of her chair. But how? He was perfectly well this morning. Dr. Finch hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly, unconsciously, toward the doorway, as if visualizing the scene behind him. He has been struck on the back of the head, he said, violently. There is no question of accident. And the police? Demanded Miss Hartwell sharply. Surely they must be summoned at once. Naturally, said Colonel Bantry. I shall telephone Inspector Slack immediately. Until he arrives, no one is to leave. I'm afraid this has become a very serious business. Ah, yes, Miss Marple thought, as a murmur of alarm and indignation swept the lawn. Inspector Slack. She suspected that the good inspector would be only too delighted to descend upon St. Mary Mead and pronounce confidently upon the matter. He was, she had often reflected, a very energetic man. Whether that energy always went in the right direction was another question. Her gaze rested momentarily on Elena Whitmore, who sat staring straight ahead, lips pressed tightly together, on Dr. Finch, whose hand, holding a cigarette he had not yet lit, trembled almost imperceptibly, and on Miss Hartwell, whose quick, calculating eyes missed very little indeed. The scarab of Amenhotep had vanished. A scholar with enemies, a beautiful wife, a devoted pupil, a hungry journalist. Oh yes, thought Miss Marple, already there was quite a lot of human nature on display. And human nature, in Miss Marple's extensive experience, was always the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or on the banks of the Nile. Inspector Slack stepped out of the motor car with an air of suppressed irritation, as though murder at a garden party were an unreasonable imposition upon his afternoon. He took in the cardboard sphinx, the painted barge, and the clusters of anxious villagers with one sweeping, disapproving glance. Now then, what's all this? He demanded, though Colonel Bantry was already striding toward him. Afternoon? Slack, the colonel said briskly. Afraid we've got a nasty business here. Professor Whitmore, killed in that contraption there. Blow to the back of the head, so Dr. Finch says. And a valuable artifact missing. Slack's brows shot up. Artifact? You mean this is about those foreign trinkets he's always going on about? He sniffed. Right. No one is to leave the premises. I'll want names. And I'll want them now. The words fell like stones into a pond. Immediately ripples of consternation spread among the guests. Mrs. Price Ridley announced shrilly that she had a weak heart and could not possibly be detained. Lady Ashford muttered something about her chauffeur and the evening train to London. Miss Hartwell looked as though Inspector Slack had just promised her 3 front-page headlines and a serialization. Miss Marple, sitting quietly beside Mrs. Bantry, saw something else. Elena Whitmore, who had stood rigidly composed until that moment, visibly flinched at the mention of the artifact. Her hand went instinctively to her throat before she seemed to master herself. Foreign trinkets indeed, murmured Miss Hartwell under her breath, near enough for Miss Marple to hear. The scarab of Amenhotep is worth a small fortune on the black market. Black markets? Slack repeated sharply, catching the phrase. We'll have no talk of that, miss. This is a straightforward case of assault and robbery, that's what it is. Likely some outsider slipped in, took his chance, and bolted before anyone noticed. Miss Marple's needles clicked again, though she had quite forgotten what stitch she was on. An outsider, she reflected, would be at a very great disadvantage indeed in a village like St. Mary Mead, where every face was known and every movement remarked upon. No murder, in her experience, was almost always a matter of proximity. Colonel Bantry led Inspector Slack toward the replica barge, accompanied by Dr. Finch and a constable. The rest of the guests were shepherded toward the refreshments tent, where they clustered in tight whispers, like birds in a storm. It's the curse, Mrs. Price Ridley declared yet again, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and satisfaction. "Mark my words, tampering with the tombs of heathen kings can bring nothing but disaster." "Rubbish," snapped Miss Hartwell, eyes flashing. "The professor made enemies, not mummies. There were accusations at the museum, weren't there, about smuggling and forged provenance papers." Miss Marple listened, apparently only half attentive. So the rumors had reached even an enterprising journalist from London. She recalled having read something vaguely scandalous in the Times some months earlier, but the details had not lingered in her mind. Human nature was far more reliably persistent than newspaper headlines. "Enemies," Elena Whitmore repeated distantly, as though the word had an unpleasant taste. "Nigel had many professional rivals, Miss Hartwell, but that is hardly the same as enemies." "It depends," Miss Marple observed mildly, "on how much those rivals believed they had lost, my dear. People do sometimes feel very strongly about the loss of opportunity or reputation." Elena looked at her with a faint start, as if momentarily recalling that the white-haired lady with the knitting might, in fact, be listening. "My husband was a great man, Miss Marple," supplied Dolly Bantry hastily. "Miss Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead." "Of everywhere," murmured Miss Hartwell under her breath, but her pencil did not pause. From the barge there came the muffled sound of voices, then Inspector Slack's louder tones. "Handle that carefully, Constable. And mind you don't smear anything. We'll need to know who touched what." Presently, Slack emerged, his expression more serious than before. "Right," he announced. Professor Whitmore was struck from behind with one of his own statuettes. Heavy little brute, no sign of the scarab. Whoever did this knew where it was kept and took it in a hurry. I want a list of everyone who went near that cabin in the last hour. And before that, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. For surely the opportunity to plan such a very dreadful thing would have begun some time before this afternoon. Slack eyed her with mingled respect and annoyance. "We'll come to that, Miss Marple. For now, no one leaves. I'll be taking statements. Starting," he added, his gaze resting on Elena Whitmore with the widow. Miss Marple folded her knitting in her lap. The pattern, she felt sure, was going to become very intricate indeed. Inspector Slack returned from the barge a quarter of an hour later, with the air of a man whose suspicions had found agreeable pasture. He beckoned Colonel Bantry and Dr. Finch aside, but his voice, as usual, did not trouble itself to remain discreet. "Blow to the back of the head with something heavy, most likely that bronze statuette from the professor's desk," he announced. "Glass case smashed afterward, scarab removed. Clear as day, murder and theft together. Lady Ashford, Mrs. Price Ridley, and Mrs. Bantry saw the aftermath. Someone slipped in just before the ladies went aboard, did the deed, and slipped out again while their eyes were adjusting to the dark." Miss Marple, from her unobtrusive seat by the rhododendrons, reflected that things were very seldom as clear as that when Inspector Slack declared them so. Sergeant Lake, methodical and precise, approached with a list. "Names of all present, sir, and where they state they were between 4 o'clock and past. We can verify as we go." "Good," said Slack. "Start with the staff at Gossington. Robbery, inside job. Always begin close to home." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the house, where the Bantresses' parlour-maid, Gladys, stood pale and wide-eyed beside the kitchen door. Gladys was engaged to a gardener from Old Hall, Miss Marple recalled, a young man who disliked Professor Whitmore heartily for some obscure reason connected with village allotments. Human animosities, she knew, were like bindweed. They twisted into the oddest places. It was at that moment that Elena Whitmore crossed the lawn, moving with an odd, restrained determination. She stopped before Inspector Slack, her chin lifted. "Inspector," she said quietly, I think I should tell you something before you hear it distorted from other mouths. My husband and I were not on the best of terms." Her dark eyes flashed briefly. "We quarreled this afternoon, in his study before the guests arrived. Several of the servants may have heard raised voices. There was a slight stir among those in earshot. Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Price Ridley's ears positively pricked. "About what, madam?" Slack asked, his pencil ready, interest unmistakable. "About money," Elena replied. "And other matters. He intended to sell the scarab abroad. He had quarreled with his partners, gentlemen in London who provided funds for his expeditions. I told him it was madness. He implied I should keep to my role as ornament." Her mouth tightened. "I slapped him. He laughed. We did not speak again before." She gestured toward the barge. "Partners?" Slack repeated sharply. "Names?" "Mr. Harold Lysander, of Lysander & Co., investment brokers," she said, "and a Mr. Geoffrey Vale, the art dealer in Bond Street. They are not here, of course." Miss Marple, who had once heard Colonel Bantry complain bitterly about Mr. Lysander's aggressive acquisition of local property, allowed herself a small, inward nod. Financial entanglements, in her experience, made more enduring quarrels than broken hearts. "Thank you, madam." "That will be confirmed," Slack said. "For now, you'll remain available for questioning. Dr. Finch, see that she doesn't overstrain herself." It was perhaps unfortunate that the inspector phrased it so, for several heads turned at once to observe Dr. Finch's involuntary start and Elena's faint, ironic smile. Appearances, Miss Marple knew, were treacherous, yet how very eager people were to believe the most scandalous explanation. As dusk thickened into early evening, Colonel Bantry insisted the guests come inside. "Police orders or no, Dolly, people can't stand shivering in the garden all night," he muttered. "We'll keep them in the drawing room until the inspector says otherwise." Miss Marple found herself settled on a small sofa near the fireplace, her knitting once more in her lap, while around her the village's social fabric shifted into new revealing patterns. Snatches of conversation floated to her. Lady Ashford's indignation at being mixed up in a murder. Mrs. Price Ridley's fervent belief in curses. Young Mr. Pritchard, the Bantry's scholarly neighbor, expounding eagerly on Egyptian funerary rites, as though the occasion were an academic seminar rather than a crime scene. It was during one such discourse that Miss Marple's attention was caught by an apparently trivial remark. Mr. Pritchard, peering through his spectacles, said earnestly to Miss Hartwell, "Of course, the professor insisted the scarab be placed facing east. Said it must never look toward the setting sun. He was most particular about that on the barge." "Facing east?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Are you quite sure, Mr. Pritchard?" "Quite, Miss Marple. I helped him position it yesterday afternoon. He even corrected me." Miss Marple's fingers paused over her wool, for Mrs. Bantry had described, with horrified exactness, how the empty velvet mount inside the smashed case had been turned toward the west, the jagged glass scattered accordingly. A tiny, untidied inconsistency in a scene that someone had tried very hard to arrange. She resumed her knitting, her expression seraphic. That little turn, from east to west, might be nothing at all, or it might be exactly the sort of small human oversight that separated true robbery from staged appearance. By the time the last of the guests had been questioned and allowed to leave, the sky over Gossington Hall had turned a deep indigo, and the paper lotus flowers around the lawn stirred faintly in the night breeze. Miss Marple walked home along the familiar lane with Mrs. Bantry, the two old friends moving at a gentle, unhurried pace that belied the disturbance of the afternoon. "I shall never forget it, Jane," Mrs. Bantry murmured, shuddering. Nigel lying there, that dreadful wound, All that broken glass. And the way Elena didn't. Well, I know it's uncharitable of me, but she didn't seem quite shattered. People have the oddest ways of showing grief, Dolly, Miss Marple replied mildly. I remember old Mrs. Harbottle laughing quite uncontrollably at her husband's funeral. It upset everyone terribly till it came out she'd been in hysterics. Mrs. Bantry gave a faint, reluctant chuckle. Even so, one can't help wondering. There were stories, about her and Dr. Finch. Young Mrs. Lester told me her maid saw them together in the village, looking, well, not quite proper, and now his cufflink under the desk. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. That is the interesting thing, isn't it? How very obligingly incriminating it is. What do you mean, Jane? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Did you notice, Dolly dear, that the professor's shoes were damp with fresh grass stains along the sides? Most curious for a man who claimed not to have set foot off his little Nile barge all afternoon. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Why, no, I can't say I did. You are terrifying, Jane. Positively terrifying. The following morning, St. Mary Mead buzzed like an overturned beehive. At the High Street grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley declared it a crime of passion. At the post office, Miss Hartwell's presence in the village was debated with relish, whether she was merely a journalist or something in the Foreign Office. And at the butcher's, Mr. Pritchard solemnly pronounced it an inevitable manifestation of the Pharaoh's curse. Miss Marple, appearing at the grocer's for her usual modest purchases, listened to the chorus of theories with an air of vague benevolence. She showed particular interest when Mrs. Finch, the doctor's landlady, confided in a hushed voice that the inspector had been round early, asking detailed questions about Marcus's comings and goings. Of course, I told him, Mrs. Finch declared, her chest swelling with the gravity of her role, that Dr. Finch was home until nearly 3 o'clock, going over his accounts. I took him some tea myself. But then he went out. He did. Said he was wanted at Gossington to help with the arrangements. Yes, murmured Miss Marple, apparently more absorbed in examining a head of lettuce than in the fate of the village doctor. Accounts can be so tiresome. I remember a young man in Much Benham who tried to commit murder rather than face his bookmaker's ledger. Most unfortunate for him that he chose rat poison. His aunt had been dosing the whole household with it for years in the form of health tonic. Mrs. Finch, not entirely sure what this anecdote implied, clucked sympathetically. Later that morning, Miss Marple was sitting in her cottage parlour, sorting through a pile of mending, when the timid knock she had expected came at the door. It was Dr. Finch, looking more haggard than his years warranted. Miss Marple, he began. Once she had settled him with tea, I believe I'm in very serious trouble. I expect you are, my dear. Miss Marple replied gently. When a man finds his cufflink so thoughtfully placed beneath a murdered colleague's desk, it rarely indicates a simple misunderstanding. He winced. I swear to you, I didn't kill him. I argued with him, yes, about Elena, about the way he treated her, about his threats to ruin my career if I didn't keep away. But I left him alive. Someone must have put that cufflink there afterward. Miss Marple regarded him over her spectacles. Then the important question, Dr. Finch, is not whether you are innocent, but whom it would most benefit to have you thought guilty. People rarely risk framing another unless they themselves have a very great deal to hide. Outside, the church clock chimed 11, and Miss Marple, hearing the faint echo of it, thought of the Norman tower's crumbling stones, of Egyptian tombs, of treasures taken and tempers inflamed. Somewhere amid these overlapping layers of past and present, of buried things brought into the light, lay the small, precise truth she sought. Miss Marple watched the shadowed figure disappear around the side of the house with a deliberation that spoke more of intent than of fear. She considered quietly for a moment, then turned back to Mrs. Bantry, whose eyes were very round indeed. Jane, who on earth? "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple said gently, "I think it would be most unwise for us to speculate aloud while we are, strictly speaking, somewhere we ought not to be. Perhaps we should return to the house by the front path and see who has just arrived, as any law-abiding guests would." They slipped cautiously from the barge, Miss Marple casting one last glance at the darkening garden. The constable, who had been temporarily distracted by a cup of tea from the kitchen, met them halfway with an apologetic blush. "Thought you'd gone back to the house, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Bantry. "Inspector said no one was to meddle about the barge." "Quite right," Mrs. Bantry replied briskly. "We were merely retrieving a misplaced spectacle case. All sorted now." Constable. Inside Gossington Hall, the atmosphere had shifted from public crisis to private strain. The servants moved about with the hushed efficiency of those accustomed to sudden upheaval. Doors closed more softly than usual. Voices dropped instinctively. Miss Marple, from her quiet chair by the drawing-room window, observed the entrances and exits with the deep contentment of a cat at a mouse-hole. It did not take long for her patience to be rewarded. The drawing-room door opened hesitantly, and Miss Diana Hartwell slipped in, glancing over her shoulder before she did so. Gone was the brisk self-assurance of the young journalist. In its place was a taut wariness that made her appear younger and far more vulnerable. She started slightly on seeing Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I thought everyone had retired for the night." "At my age," Miss Marple replied peacefully, "one finds going up and down stairs after a tiring day quite fatiguing. I prefer to rest here a little first." "You have been out of the house, I think." Diana's hand went instinctively to the pocket of her jacket, where something squared and rigid created a faint outline beneath the fabric. "Only for a breath of air," she said quickly. "It's been rather stifling." "Grief often is," Miss Marple agreed. "Though you did not know Professor Whitmore well, did you, my dear?" "Professionally, of course, but not intimately." Diana hesitated. "I knew rather more about him than he realized," she said at last, sinking into the armchair opposite. "Men like Whitmore never imagine the damage they cause. They treat people, especially women and natives, as tools to be used and discarded. I was writing an expose, you see. That was my real reason for coming." "About the scarab?" Miss Marple asked gently. "About the scarab, and about how it left Egypt, and about the men in London who financed everything. Vale and Lysander Antiquities, they call themselves. Antiquities, smuggling, bribery. The line is very thin. Whitmore crossed it long ago." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "You have been very industrious, Miss Hartwell." Diana's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Industrious or not, I've destroyed whatever evidence I had. It was in my satchel. Someone broke into my room while we were all outside earlier. My notes, my photographs, my letters from Cairo, gone. Whoever killed Whitmore wanted more than just an artifact. They wanted the story buried with him." The revelation settled over the room like a fresh layer of dust. Miss Marple watched the young woman's trembling hands and her two bright eyes, and thought of all the small, reckless acts youth commits in the name of righteous indignation. "And yet," Miss Marple said very softly, "whoever broke into your room didn't find everything, did they, my dear? There's something still in your pocket, quite stiff and rectangular. Something you went out into the garden to examine by yourself." Diana's hand flew again to her jacket, this time protectively. For a moment defiance warred with common sense, then something in Miss Marple's mild, unthreatening gaze seemed to reassure her. "It's a photograph," she said in a low voice. "Taken this afternoon, by accident, really. I don't think the killer knows it exists. And if I'm right about what it shows, then Dr. Finch is innocent, and someone else is in very grave danger indeed." For a moment the house seemed to hold its breath, every corridor echoing with the aftermath of breaking glass and shouted orders. Colonel Bantry thundered away toward the commotion, boots ringing on the tiles, while the young constable from the garden came blundering in at the front, torn between duty to his post and the unmistakable sound of trouble. Miss Marple, by contrast, did not rush. Years of village experience had taught her that those who ran first often saw least. She observed instead Diana Hartwell's white-knuckled grip on the telegram, the way her eyes darted not toward the noise, but toward the photograph she still held, the slight hesitation before she slipped it into her inner jacket pocket instead of her notebook. "You must be very careful with that picture, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Things that prove innocence can, unfortunately, be terribly dangerous when certain people are determined to maintain a different story." Diana swallowed. "I know. I hadn't intended anyone to see it yet. Not until I was certain. But Lysander forced my hand. Men like Mr. Lysander," Miss Marple observed mildly, "are rarely the final player in such games. They are more often the sort of people who tidy up after others' messes, and occasionally create rather worse ones in the process." Their quiet colloquy was interrupted by Colonel Bantry's return, breathing heavily and radiating indignation. "Some blighter tried to slip out through the library window," he snapped. "Got away across the shrubbery before we could collar him. Left this behind, though." He held out a dark length of cloth. Miss Marple did not need to touch it to recognize the texture, rich, heavy, faintly rustling. Silk. "It appears," she said softly, "that our missing costume has made its appearance at last. The garment, when fully displayed across the library table, proved unmistakable. A long robe of black and gold, ornamented in Egyptian style, with an elaborate collar that glittered with imitation jewels. One sleeve bore a faint smear of something darker, almost black in the lamplight, but with the sticky quality Miss Marple had seen before." "Blood?" Diana asked quietly. "Inspector Slack can answer that," Miss Marple replied, "though I imagine he will leap to the conclusion that whoever wore this robe struck the fatal blow." Diana considered this. It would fit, wouldn't it? The curtains in the barge cabin, the rustling Mrs. Bantry heard, the professor already on the floor when she entered. Someone in costume could have slipped out unseen while the ladies screamed. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed placidly, "if one accepts the idea that the professor was killed at the exact moment of discovery. But we must always remember, my dear, that the clock of human drama and the clock of actual time rarely strike together." Colonel Bantry frowned. "You mean he might have been dead earlier? Or later?" Miss Marple said. "It depends who set the stage, and for whose benefit." They were still gathered round the discarded robe when Inspector Slack reappeared, ruddy with self-importance and annoyance. "Another attempted break-in, Mrs. Bantry. Your party's turned into a regular penny thriller. Library window jemmied. Intruder fled. We'll run him to ground before morning, never fear." He eyed the robe with a mixture of satisfaction and puzzlement. Well, looks like our murderer dressed for the occasion. Bit theatrical for a doctor in a country practice, wouldn't you say, Miss Marple?" "People sometimes surprise us, Inspector," Miss Marple murmured, "though I've generally found that the more elaborate the costume, the more anxious the wearer is to be someone other than himself." Slack snorted. "Psychology again. Give me a good solid bit of evidence any day, and I've enough of that against Dr. Finch to satisfy a judge." "Have you, Inspector?" Diana asked quietly. "Even when there's proof someone else was in that cabin, dressed to conceal his identity, coming and going through windows, searching for documents that have nothing to do with Dr. Finch at all?" Slack gave her a sharp look. "Proof? What proof?" Diana's hand moved instinctively toward her inner pocket, then stopped. Her eyes widened. She patted the other side of her jacket. Then both. Color drained from her face. "The photograph," she whispered. "It's gone." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Though her mind had already leapt ahead, somewhere in the house, or perhaps already out in the village night, walked a person who could remove a damning piece of evidence from a journalist's inner pocket without so much as disturbing the line of her jacket. "Dear me," she said quietly. "Our murderer is not only theatrical, but quite remarkably deft. That does narrow things down rather." Morning in St. Mary Mead broke grey and heavy, as though the sky itself disapproved of the previous day's theatricals. News of the murder had, of course, spread faster than any influenza, and by 9 o'clock the village was humming with speculation. Miss Marple, walking down the high street with her shopping basket, heard enough competing theories to fill several sensational novels. At the grocer's, Mr. Petherick opined that these foreign women led men to ruin. At the butcher's, Mrs. Hart insisted it was those London types with their money schemes, and at the post office, young Mr. Pritchard asserted, with the earnestness of the recently educated, that it was clearly an inside job connected to illicit antiquities trafficking. Miss Marple listened politely, contributing nothing more provocative than an occasional "Indeed," or "How very remarkable," while her mind arranged the fragments of gossip into more useful patterns. Her real interest that morning lay with the post office. She waited patiently until the counter was free and approached with her usual gentle manner. "A dreadful business, Mr. Pritchard," she observed. "One can hardly take in all that has happened. I expect you've been kept quite busy. Telegrams and registered parcels and such." Mr. Pritchard flushed with importance. "Positively overrun, Miss Marple." "Why? Only late last night we had a special acceptance, well past closing hours. Inspector Slack himself authorized it, on account of the urgency." "How very obliging of him," Miss Marple said. "A local person sending something important, no doubt." Mr. Pritchard hesitated, torn between professional discretion and the irresistible urge to share. "Well, I shouldn't say, really, but it was addressed to the British Museum, it was. Registered, insured, the lot. Very valuable contents, one would surmise." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "One would, indeed. And from whom did this important parcel originate, if an old woman may be allowed to satisfy her curiosity? I find these little details help one make sense of the world." "It was Mrs. Whitmore," he blurted. "Came in just before 10 with Inspector Slack. Said she was returning something that never should have left the museum in the first place. I had to enter the value as undisclosed antiquity on the form." So the scarab, Miss Marple reflected as she thanked him and departed, had quietly gone back to its rightful home. That single act undermined half the village's theories. A thief who hastened to return stolen goods at some personal risk was an unusual creature indeed. She found Elena Whitmore at Gossington Hall's breakfast table, untouched coffee before her and yesterday's dramatic scarlet exchanged for a sober grey dress. Her eyes, however, were more alive than they had been the previous evening, bright with a wary intelligence no longer masked by wifely performance. "You've heard, then," Elena said, before Miss Marple could speak. "About the parcel." "Villages are very efficient at such things," Miss Marple replied, settling herself. "You did quite right, my dear. Stolen things have a way of bringing misfortune to all who handle them, though I fancy your husband knew that better than most." Elena's composure wavered. Nigel thought he was clever. He believed that as long as the papers proved the scarab came from a private collection, no one would look any deeper. But those papers were forged. Thomas Amos told him so, the last time they met. "Ah, yes, Mr. Amos." Miss Marple's tone was mild. The man who died of fever in Egypt, yet apparently sends telegrams from London and appears in photographs taken at English garden parties. Elena stared at her. You know, I know that men declared dead abroad sometimes find it convenient to remain so, Miss Marple said, particularly when there are legal difficulties or personal betrayals to be escaped. Elena's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Thomas was Nigel's partner. And my fiancé. He died 2 years ago on the Nile expedition. Nigel came back alone, with the relics and a rather different story about what had happened at the dig. I married him instead. Thomas wrote to me last month. He was alive. He said Nigel had left him for dead. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pattern was beginning to emerge with familiar clarity. Greed, betrayal, a woman caught between 2 men, and a partnership in ruins. Before she could probe further, the door opened, and Diana Hartwell entered unannounced, her face pale but determined. Inspector Slack has released Dr. Finch, she said without preamble. Someone attacked Harold Lysander by the river last night. He's in hospital with a fractured skull. And pinned to his pillow this morning, they found this. She held out a small object wrapped in gauze. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully to reveal a golden beetle-shaped amulet, gleaming dully in the morning light. The scarab of Amenhotep had not gone back to the British Museum after all. For a long, suspended second, no one moved. The golden scarab glinted against Thomas Amos's hollow chest, a tiny, insolent spark of antiquity in the damp English graveyard. Then, Elena made a small, strangled sound and half-raised a gloved hand, as if to ward off a ghost. "Thomas," she whispered, "you're alive." "If this is death," Amos replied dryly, his voice hoarse but controlled, "then the afterlife is remarkably similar to a damp day in Dorset. Inspector Slack recovered first. Thomas Amos, I presume," he said, stepping forward with official briskness. "You'll come with me, sir. I've questions to put to you about the murder of Professor Nigel Whitmore." "Of course you do," Amos answered, unfastening the chain with slow, deliberate fingers. "You've arrested the wrong man. You've ignored the obvious. And now the dead inconveniently refuse to stay in their graves. I expected no less." He placed the scarab carefully in Slack's outstretched evidence bag, then turned to Miss Marple with a kind of wry courtesy. "You, madam, are the only person here I trust to listen. You have the eyes of someone who actually sees." Miss Marple inclined her head, acknowledging the compliment without vanity. "One does one's best," she said mildly. "Perhaps if we were all to adjourn somewhere less draughty, Inspector. The vicarage, perhaps. T has a remarkable talent for encouraging truth." Slack grumbled about old ladies and their tea, but the practical advantages of the vicarage, close at hand and respectably neutral, proved persuasive. Within 20 minutes, the key players were gathered in Reverend Clement's modest sitting room. Inspector Slack and Sergeant Lake, Elena Whitmore still pale beneath her veil, Dr. Finch, tense and watchful, Diana Hartwell with her concealed notebook, Harold Lysander, grim-jawed and defensive, and Thomas Amos himself, sitting stiffly in a hard wooden chair, as if it were some sort of penance. Miss Marple took a place by the hearth, her knitting emerging as naturally as breathing. To the uninitiated, she appeared a harmless background presence. Those who knew her better, Reverend Clement among them, understood that this was precisely when she was at her most dangerous. "Now then," Slack began heavily, "let's have it from the beginning, Mr. Amos. You were supposed to be dead. Why aren't you?" Amos's thin lips twitched. "Malaria, Inspector, like many unpleasant things, is occasionally survivable. Nigel preferred me dead, for legal and romantic convenience. He reported my death in Luxor, forged the necessary documents, and took both my share of our discoveries and my fiancée. Elena flinched at this, though she said nothing. Dr. Finch's jaw tightened. "And you came back to England for revenge?" Slack pounced. "I came back," Amos said slowly, "because 7 years ago I signed papers granting Whitmore temporary control of certain artifacts. Control, not ownership. When I recovered, I discovered he'd sold much of our joint work through Vale and Lysander under his sole name, and was preparing to sell the scarab abroad. I returned to reclaim what was mine. And conveniently," Slack retorted, "your partner ends up with his head bashed in and his precious scarab missing from his body." "On the contrary," Amos replied coolly, "I arranged to meet Whitmore privately after the garden party. I even sent a telegram to Mr. Lysander, warning that the game is nearly finished." He nodded toward Harold. "You received it." Lysander's face darkened. "I received it, yes, and found your name stamped all over this sordid business. You were at the party disguised as a waiter. Diana's photograph proved that." Diana's eyes flashed. "And someone stole that photograph from my pocket. Very neatly. Along with attempting to steal my notes, Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. It takes a certain suppleness of fingers to pick pockets and force locks," she observed, sounding as if she were discussing crochet. "Theatrical folk, card sharps, or perhaps someone accustomed to delicate work with fragile objects?" Dr. Finch looked startled. "You can't mean—" "I mean nothing, dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "I merely notice patterns. For instance, how Mr. Amos has walked today with a slight limp, quite genuine, the result of long illness, I fancy. Hardly the agile figure Colonel Bantry described vaulting through his library window last night." Amos's weary amusement returned. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I haven't vaulted anywhere in years." Slack frowned. "Then who broke into the house? Who wore that Egyptian robe? Who planted Dr. Finch's cufflink under the body?" "Someone," Miss Marple said softly, "who needed Thomas Amos to exist as a convenient spectre, but could not rely upon his cooperation. Someone who knew enough of the past to use him as a mask." Her eyes drifted almost idly to Elena Whitmore's gloved hands, to Lysander's restless fingers, to the faint ink stain on Diana's cuff, and finally to the tiny, almost invisible thread of black silk clinging to the inside of a sleeve that ought to have been pristine. "Yes," she murmured, more to herself than the room, "I think we are almost ready for the final act. One must simply set the stage correctly and see who cannot resist taking their cue." It was Diana Hartwell who stepped from behind the yew, her notebook in one hand, her expression composed and faintly apologetic, as though she had arrived a trifle late to a scheduled interview, rather than the climax of a murder investigation. The faint, clean scent of peppermint drifted ahead of her on the damp air. "I'm afraid I missed some of that," she said lightly, though her eyes were very sharp indeed. "Quite a scene for a village funeral, Inspector. A resurrected archaeologist, a stolen scarab, and now, what was it you said, Miss Marple? An elaborate performance?" Miss Marple regarded her with mild interest. "Yes, my dear. Only, you see, performances have authors as well as actors. And in this particular case, I think the author has allowed her taste for drama to rather overreach itself." Diana's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her notebook. "Author? I'm only a reporter, Miss Marple. I record events. I don't create them." "But you do shape them," Miss Marple replied gently. "With words, with photographs, with what you choose to show and what you choose to conceal. For instance, that very interesting photograph you told Mr. Lysander about. The one you said showed Thomas Amos at the garden party. Taken, you claimed, quite by accident. Inspector Slack seized on this eagerly. Yes, that photograph. Where is it, Miss Hartwell? We've heard a great deal about it and seen nothing. Gone. I'm afraid, Diana said with a rueful shrug. Stolen from my pocket during the excitement last night. Convenient for someone, certainly, but hardly my doing. Miss Marple's voice remained mild, almost apologetic. That is precisely the difficulty, my dear. You see, we must accept several remarkable coincidences if we are to believe you, that a skilled pickpocket happened to be present at the same party as the one person investigating the professor's questionable acquisitions, that this invisible thief chose to steal only your most incriminating piece of evidence, and then to break into Colonel Bantry's house in an Egyptian costume so obligingly left behind. Diana's smile sharpened. You're suggesting I invented the theft? Oh no, Miss Marple said. I think you committed it. Not only the theft, but the murder as well. The murmuring among the mourners rose to a gasp. Inspector Slack stiffened. Dr. Finch stared, open-mouthed. Only Thomas Amos watched Diana with something like grim recognition. You had every qualification, Miss Marple continued in that same gentle tone. You knew from your London sources that the scarab was stolen from the museum. You arranged to come here under the pretense of writing an article. You have nimble fingers, so often ink-stained, I noticed, quite capable of unscrewing a cufflink and dropping it beneath a dead man's desk. You hired the Egyptian priest's robe, intending, I think, to confront the professor dramatically and frighten him into confessing for your exclusive story. Diana laughed, but there was a brittle edge to it now. A melodramatic theory, Miss Marple. I expected better of you, but criminals are often melodramatic, Miss Marple persisted, and journalists, ambitious young ones, are sometimes desperate. Your London position was not secure, was it, Miss Hartwell? A failure, rather a scandal, a story you'd embellished beyond what could be proved. Diana's eyes flashed. The hit had gone home. You hoped to redeem yourself with a great expose, Miss Marple went on. The fallen museum darling, the stolen artifacts, the living dead partner. Only, when you confronted the professor privately in the barge cabin, he did not respond as you'd wished. He laughed at you, perhaps, threatened to ruin you, to expose your previous disgrace. Men in positions of power can be very unkind when cornered. Elena Whitmore made a small involuntary sound of agreement. In that moment, Miss Marple said softly, your story changed. You seized the nearest heavy object, the bronze god from his desk, struck him down from behind. It was not premeditated murder, I think. It was rage, humiliation, fear. But afterwards, you became a reporter again. You began to stage the scene, to direct it. Inspector Slack swallowed hard. The display case, the glass. Exactly, Miss Marple nodded. You opened it with the key you had seen the professor use, removed the scarab from his neck, broke the glass from inside so it would look like theft. You scattered his papers, pulled out drawers. You planted Dr. Finch's cufflink, taken earlier when you so kindly adjusted his sleeve, while pretending to admire his watch. Then you left by the rear of the barge, just as Mrs. Bantry and the ladies approached from the front. Diana's face had grown very pale. And your proof, Miss Marple? Beyond charming speculations? Your proofs, my dear, Miss Marple corrected gently. You provided most of them yourself. The missing photograph that no one but you ever saw. The Egyptian costume, found not hidden, but dropped in a hasty escape. The attempt to break into Colonel Bantry's library and Amos's papers, because once you realized Thomas Amos was alive, you saw that he could destroy your carefully constructed narrative. She turned to Amos. And you, Mr. Amos, returning unexpectedly, forced her to improvise. She tried to steal your telegram from Mr. Lysander, then your identity from your own story. When that failed, she shifted suspicion again. To you, to Dr. Finch, to the widow. Each new lead she offered the inspector nudged the narrative away from herself. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. And the peppermint? A small thing, Miss Marple admitted, but small things are what people forget to disguise. The barge smelled of camphor and peppermint when Amos entered after the murder. Mrs. Price Ridley sucks mince, yes, but she never went near the barge. You, Miss Hartwell, offered them liberally all afternoon. You were the only one who moved freely between every group, every scene. And you were also the only one who seemed to know, almost before it happened, where the next piece of drama would occur. The silence stretched. Wind stirred the yew branches. A rook called harshly overhead. Diana Hartwell looked slowly around the circle of faces, suspicious, shocked, some already condemning. For a moment, her expression was nakedly bitter. "I only ever wanted the truth," she said hoarsely, "to show what men like Whitmore and Lysander and Amos really are. Thieves in linen suits. And so," Miss Marple replied gently, "you became something worse in order to expose them. That is the real tragedy, my dear." Diana's shoulders slumped. She let the notebook fall from her hand. It landed on the damp grass with a soft thud. Pages splayed like a broken bird. "Well then," she said, her voice suddenly very tired. "Inspector, I suppose you'd better write the last chapter." Inspector Slack stepped forward, reading her expression with the blunt certainty of long practice. "Diana Hartwell, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Professor Nigel Whitmore. You needn't say anything unless—" But his formal words faded into the background as Miss Marple, standing a little apart, watched the scene with grave sadness. Human nature, she reflected, was very much like an archaeological dig. Layers upon layers, the bright surfaces concealing darker strata beneath. Ambition, vanity, humiliation, love, revenge. None of it was new. Only the arrangements changed. Elena Whitmore leaned on Dr. Finch's arm, her veil stirring in the wind. Thomas Amos closed his hand around the scarab, its golden curves vanishing into his scarred palm. The mourners began to drift away, already reshaping the tale for their own retellings over tea. Miss Marple turned her steps toward the lich gate, her thoughts already moving to her rose cuttings and the new pattern she meant to try in pale yellow wool. Murder, after all, was only one of many patterns she had learned to recognize. And, like all patterns once seen, it could never quite be unseen. The days that followed brought a curious stillness to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were catching its breath after the upheaval. Newspaper vans had come and gone, leaving behind sensational headlines about the scarab murder and Egyptian curse in Quiet Village, though Miss Marple reflected that the truth had been far more prosaic and far more tragic than any talk of curses. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell held court over their teacups, explaining with great authority how they had suspected Diana Hartwell, now publicly revealed as Diana Vale, from the very beginning, though their recollections of exactly when this suspicion had taken root varied with each retelling. Colonel Bantry, for his part, took some satisfaction in recounting how he had pursued the Egyptian priest across his own library carpet, though he tended to omit Miss Marple's rather crucial role in untangling the matter. Miss Marple herself returned to her usual routine with outward serenity, tending her roses, helping with the church flowers, and offering gentle, practical advice to the more troubled of the village's parishioners. Yet beneath her placid exterior there remained a certain reflective melancholy, born of having witnessed yet another instance of human frailty turned to violence. One afternoon, about a week after the funeral, she found herself once more at Gossington Hall, taking tea with Mrs. Bantry and Elena Whitmore in the smaller drawing room. The grander rooms had been closed up. The house felt echoing and oddly diminished, as though Nigel Whitmore's theatrical presence had been the only thing that truly suited its scale. Elena had discarded the heavy widow's veil, though she still wore black. The severity of mourning dress suited her dark beauty, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "I feel as if I've woken from some long, rather horrible dream," she said quietly, stirring her tea without drinking it. Nigel, Thomas, Geoffrey Vale, the scarab, all those years of secrets and lies. And then this poor girl Diana, trying to clean it all away with one violent gesture. "Not clean," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Punish, perhaps. One seldom cleans anything properly with blood. It only stains in different places." Elena gave a faint, bitter smile. "You are very direct, Miss Marple." "One must be with the truth," Miss Marple replied. "People are so inclined to embroider it, much as some ladies do with their life stories, but in the end, it is always the plain stitches that hold." Dr. Finch arrived a few minutes later, his professional manner a shade more assured now that suspicion no longer hung over him like a thundercloud. The coroner's inquest had returned a verdict of murder against Diana Vale, and Inspector Slack, faced with her full confession and Amos's corroboration, had been obliged, if somewhat grudgingly, to admit that his early enthusiasm for the jealous doctor theory had been premature. "I wanted to thank you again, Miss Marple," Dr. Finch said earnestly, once Mrs. Bantry had tactfully busied herself at the sideboard. "If you hadn't questioned that business with the broken glass and the scarab, I might very well be awaiting trial for a crime I didn't commit." Miss Marple smiled mildly over her knitting. "I merely noticed that certain things did not fit together quite as neatly as they ought. When evidence is too tidy, one becomes suspicious. Real life," she added, "is almost always rather untidy." Thomas Amos, she knew, had already left England, taking the scarab not to some black market dealer, as many had whispered, but to the British Museum, where he had quietly arranged for it to be catalogued in his and Vale's names. No public scandal, no great revelation, just a small, precise correction of the historical record, which Miss Marple privately considered the most fitting revenge of all. "Elena," Dr. Finch said after a pause, "I hope you know that, whatever people may say, I never wished Nigel dead. I only ever wanted," he faltered, looking helplessly at Miss Marple, who pretended great interest in counting her stitches. "Wanted things to be simple," Elena finished for him. "But they never are they?" "No," Miss Marple said, tying off a row with deft fingers. "People are very seldom simple. That is what makes villages such fascinating places, and also such dangerous ones." Later, walking home along the familiar lane bordered by hawthorn hedges, Miss Marple reflected that the whole affair had been curiously like one of those picture puzzles children enjoyed. A charming English garden overlaid with hidden forms, daggers, skulls, serpents, waiting to be found by the observant eye. Under the paper Nile and cardboard sphinxes, under the polite archaeologists and earnest journalists, there had been all the ancient motives: greed, pride, jealousy, and the terrible desire to rewrite the past with one decisive act. And yet, she thought, as she paused to admire a particularly fine cluster of late roses in her own front garden, there had been kindness too, in Colonel Bantry's stubborn defense of Dr. Finch, in Amos's refusal to drag Elena publicly through the mud of his grievance, in the quiet way the village had chosen to remember Diana's father with more sympathy now that the truth was known. Human nature, Miss Marple concluded, was like her garden, perpetually struggling between weeds and flowers, never entirely one or the other. Her task, as she saw it, was not to change that balance, but simply to notice it clearly when others preferred not to look. She went inside, put the kettle on, and took up her next cardigan. This one a gentle Nile blue, which made her think of cardboard barges, vanished curses, and the complicated currents that carried people, like ancient boats, through the narrow channels of their own lives. The following Sunday evening found a small, select group gathered in Miss Marple's neat sitting room, where the lace antimacassars were as precise as ever, and the fire burned with modest but steady cheer. Outside, St. Mary Mead was already dark, the village lanes quiet after evensong. Inside, however, there remained one last piece of business to be concluded. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry occupied the sofa, he with a glass of sherry, she with her knitting abandoned in her lap. Dr. Finch sat rather awkwardly in a straight-backed chair, as if unused to simply sitting without some patient demanding his attention. Elena Whitmore, newly returned from a necessary visit to London with her solicitor, looked paler but more composed than she had in weeks. Only one chair remained empty, and Miss Marple glanced at the clock, just as a firm knock sounded at the door. "Thomas Amos," she said mildly, punctual to the minute, quite Egyptian in his sense of ceremony. Amos entered with the careful gravity of a man who had spent much of his life in formal surroundings, the hush of museum galleries, the echoing chambers of ancient tombs. He bowed slightly to Elena, nodded to Dr. Finch and the Bantrys, then took the remaining seat at Miss Marple's gentle insistence. "I am most grateful you all agreed to come," Miss Marple began, her tone as mild and unthreatening as a teapot. "They do like things to be tidy in the village, you know. Stories particularly. And while the police are satisfied, and rightly so, there were one or two small matters that, if left unspoken, might fester. I have found festering secrets to be rather bad for the Constitution." Dr. Finch colored faintly, remembering his time as chief suspect. "You mean about Diana Vale?" "In part," Miss Marple replied, "but more about what her actions revealed of others, and of yourselves." She turned her gentle gaze toward Elena. "For instance, Mrs. Whitmore's decision to remove the scarab from her husband's body. That might have looked very black indeed, had it not been explained. Indeed, Inspector Slack, who like many men prefers muscular explanations, was quite ready to see in it proof of complicity." Elena lowered her eyes. "I should have spoken sooner. I simply could not face more scandal." "Quite human," Miss Marple said kindly. "Like Mrs. Bartlett in Much Benham, who hid her husband's gambling debts for years and nearly saw her son accused of theft as a result. Protecting one truth by concealing another so often leads us into deeper muddle." She turned to Thomas Amos. "You, Mr. Amos, were remarkably honest in your account, with one small omission. You said you meant only to confront Professor Whitmore, yet your telegram to Mr. Lysander, 'The game is nearly finished. Tomorrow, the final move,' suggested something rather sterner." Amos met her gaze squarely. "I meant to ruin him, Miss Marple, not kill him. To present my evidence to his London backers, to have him discredited as he had my partner and myself. I arranged for Diana's investigation, fed her documents, hoping she would publish enough to destroy his reputation." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said. "You armed a young woman already burning with a sense of injustice. It was a dangerous thing to do without considering her volatility." He sighed. "I misjudged her. I lit the fuse and told myself it was only a candle." Mrs. Bantry dabbed at her eyes. "But at least," she said, "the museum will have the scarab now, properly, and poor Mr. Vale's name will be cleared." "As far as public record goes, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Though the deeper wrongs, broken trusts, wasted years, those can only be mended by living people, I'm afraid, and never as perfectly as we might wish." Her eyes rested thoughtfully on Elena and Dr. Finch. They both flushed, like children caught holding hands under the school hedge. "I would only urge," Miss Marple continued gently, "that in making a new life you do not build it on the same sort of convenient lies that ruined the last. Secrets have a way of seeping out at the edges, like damp through old plaster." Dr. Finch reached for Elena's hand openly this time. "There will be no lies," he said. "Not now. We have had enough of them." "Very wise," Miss Marple said, with the faintest of approving nods. "You see, one thing this unfortunate business has told us is that ghosts, be they of people, promises, or scarabs, never stay buried as long as one imagines. So it is better, when one can, to lay them properly to rest." The conversation turned then to less weighty matters: the vicar's new sermon series, the state of the rose beds after the recent storm, the astonishing price of seed catalogues. When at last her guests departed, the little house on the lane grew quiet once more. Miss Marple tidied the cups, straightened a chair, and paused by the window. The village lay peaceful under a clear night sky, the church tower rising calmly above the rooftops. Somewhere in the British Museum, a small golden scarab would soon rest behind glass, its wandering done at last. "It is curious," she reflected to herself, drawing the curtains. "The ancients weighed the heart after death, but it is in life that our choices really show what we are. Murder, in the end, is only one very dramatic way of revealing what has long been there. The rest of us reveal ourselves in much smaller acts." She set her knitting carefully in its basket, turned out the lamp, and went upstairs. Tomorrow there would be letters to answer, a new pattern to try, and no doubt some small village mystery, a missing cat, a quarrel over allotments, to engage her quiet, relentless curiosity. Human nature, she knew, would go on being itself, flawed, foolish, generous, cruel, and occasionally, when guided with a little kindness and a clear eye, surprisingly capable of redemption. And Miss Marple, in her corner of St. Mary Mead, would go on watching it, one stitch, one clue, one gentle observation at a time.